In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul in verse 20 says, "Therefore, when you meet together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper." Now, the Corinthians had a lot of things going on, but there Paul calls it the Lord's Supper, and we call it that too. Now, I think to some degree we still have a little bit of an idea of this, but in the culture in Jesus' day, in the culture of where Jesus lived, going back centuries even before Jesus, eating a meal together was had this sense of participation and fellowship, and camaraderie that brought people together. And when travelers were coming through, back when Abraham in Genesis chapter 18 saw these three fellows that were walking through, didn't know that they were messengers from God, but he invited them in and had Sarah, get all the preparations for this big meal, and they would eat a meal together, eat a supper together. There was this sense of togetherness, this sense of fellowship and communion. And so Paul earlier in chapter 10 called it communion, when we commune with Christ. And there he called it supper. There's a sense in which we sit down and we eat together with one another and with Jesus. And it's kind of hard to get that sense during this time, since we're all sequestered in our homes. And we long for the time when we get back together in our building and again eat it together with Jesus in that sense. But it reminds us that it's a meal that we're taking with the Lord, in which we're claiming fellowship with Him, in which we're claiming a relationship. And so it's important that as we eat, as we take this very simple thing, we take a cracker, well, what we call a cracker. It's still unleavened bread. I mean, it's still bread. It's unleavened. It's a cracker. But we take the cracker, we take the fruit of the vine, and when we do this, it's a supper. There's a meal there that brings us together with each other and with Christ and with the Heavenly Father. And so it's important for us to kind of use our imagination when we're taking this meal together, to make sure that we see the implications of it as well. For Paul, even though Paul Paul doesn't really correct their actual eating of the Lord's Supper. He corrects all of the injustices they do to each other in other things, when they don't treat each other with respect, and they divide each other. Because you see, when we take the Lord's Supper, we're all agreeing that Jesus' death is what brings us together. It's that sacrifice that makes us one. And when we mistreat each other outside of the Lord's Supper and in other areas, then we deny the very meal that we're eating. And so this meal then is one of vital importance, in which we proclaim our relationship to Jesus and to one another as His followers. And so take the Lord's Supper with a sense of deep meaning and purpose, and one in which we sort of think through who we are and what we are in the Lord's kingdom.